The year is 334 BC. On the European shore of a strait of treacherous blue water, the Hellespont, a young man observes the Asian coastline stretching into the distance. He is not yet 22 years old. He wears simple armor, but the purple cloak that hangs from his shoulders carries the weight of a kingdom. Around him, a heavy silence, broken only by the creaking of sails and the murmur of waves against the hulls of more than 160 ships. On the decks, thousands of eyes gaze in the same direction. Eyes of Macedonians, Thessalians, Thracians, Greeks. Men hardened by war, veterans of brutal campaigns in the Balkans and in the heart of Hellas. And yet, there was a chill in that spring air, a chill that comes from the unknown. For on the other side of that stretch of water lies not just the new land. It lies the Achaemenid Empire of Persia, the largest, richest, and oldest empire the world had ever known. A colossus stretching from the Aegean Sea to the sands of Egypt, from the Indus valleys to the steppes of Scythia. An empire that, a century and a half earlier, had sent its immense armies to subdue and burn Greece. An empire that now, in the eyes of this young man, is not a sleeping giant, but prey. His name is Alexander, son of Philip, of the Argead lineage, king of Macedonia, hegemon of the League of Corinth. But, at that moment, titles are just words. What matters is the act, the crossing, the leap into the dark. He gives the order. The oars plunge into the water. The first vessel leaves the European shore, heading towards Asia. Who was this young man who dared to defy the Lord of the world? How did a mountainous kingdom, for centuries despised as semi-barbaric by the civilized Greeks, forge the hammer that now rose to shatter an empire? This story does not begin in the Hellespont. It begins in the somber courts and bloodied battlefields of a Greece on the brink of collapse. It begins with a man who was not Alexander, but without whom Alexander would never have existed. It begins with his father.
To understand the meteoric trajectory of the arrow, it is necessary to study, in detail, the tension of the bow. And the bow that would propel Alexander to the confines of legend was patiently bent, laminated, and reinforced by Philip II of Macedon, one of the greatest political military geniuses of antiquity. When Philip, in his early 20s, ascended the throne in 359 BC, he inherited not a crown but chaos. Macedonia was on the verge of disintegration. Illyrian tribes from the northwest had inflicted a humiliating defeat, killing the previous king and 4,000 Macedonians. Thracian and Paeonian tribes plundered the eastern and northern borders. The Macedonian nobility itself, the heteroi, companions, was a collection of regional warlords more loyal to their clans than to the throne, constantly embroiled in conspiracies. And to the south, the Greek city-states looked on with profound cultural disdain. To the cultured Athenians, the Macedonians were barbarians, foreigners who babbled an unintelligible dialect, ruled by drunken and violent monarchs, more given to Homeric feasts and hunting than to philosophy or the sophisticated art of hoplite warfare. Philip, however, was a unique product of his circumstances. In his teens, he spent 3 years as a hostage in Thebes, at the height of Theban power. There, he was not treated as an ordinary prisoner, but was housed in the home of Epaminondas, the greatest military tactician in Greece at the time. Philip was an attentive student. He observed the Theban army, saw the innovation of the oblique line that destroyed Sparta at Leuctra, and understood the profound limitations of the Greek military system. The hoplite phalanx was a static force, a formation of citizens fighting seasonal campaigns. It was slow, inflexible, and dependent on flat terrain for its decisive charge. Philip dreamed of something radical, a permanent professional army, a machine that could fight on any terrain in any season. And his first act of genius was technological, yet simple: the Sarissa. This was no ordinary spear. It was a pole made of cornel wood, a dense and flexible wood measuring between 5.5 and 6.5 meters in length. At the front end, a leaf-shaped iron point, long enough to inflict a fatal wound. At the rear, a metal or leather point, the sauropter, lizard killer, which could be driven into the ground to secure the spear against a charge and serve as a counterweight. The weight was distributed between both of the soldiers' hands. The mere existence of the Sarissa imposed a new geometry of death. 5 rows of spear points projected ahead of the first line of men, creating an insurmountable iron wall before the enemy could even get within sword stroke distance. But a revolutionary weapon requires a revolutionary doctrine. Philip organized the Macedonian peasant infantry into the peasiteroi. These were not citizen soldiers, but paid professionals trained daily. They fought in the Macedonian Phalanx, a much deeper and more compact formation than the hoplite. Discipline was ironclad. They marched, maneuvered, and attacked in unison, maintaining a cohesion that transformed thousands of men into a single armored organism. The Phalanx's advance was not a race, but an unrelenting pressure, a tsunami of wood and steel that crushed everything in its path. However, Philip, the tactician, knew that the Phalanx was a monster of narrow vision, powerful from the front, but slow and vulnerable on the flanks and rear. His second masterful creation was the solution to this vulnerability, the companion, heteroi cavalry. This was not the light reconnaissance or pursuit cavalry at the time. It was heavy shock cavalry. The heteroi were young men of the Macedonian nobility, forming a personal bond with the king. Armed with a shorter, charging spear, the ziston, and protected by cuirasses of laminated linen or metal, they were the precision weapon of the army. Philip's doctrine was clear. The phalanx would be the anvil. It would advance, fix the enemy line, attract their attention, and wear them down. The companions' cavalry, concentrated at a decisive point, usually the right wing, commanded by the king himself, would be the hammer, a coordinated and devastating attack that would deliver the coup de grace to the flank or rear of the already engaged enemy. For almost 20 years, Philip used this newly forged instrument. He pacified Macedonia, subdued the Thracians and Illyrians with a series of brutal and efficient campaigns, and exploited the gold mines at Mount Pangaeus, financing his army and bribing his enemies with a torrent of philippoi, his gold coins. His policy was a mixture of strategic marriages, shrewd diplomacy, and blitzkrieg when necessary. Meanwhile, Greece to the south languished in post-Peloponnesian War exhaustion. Athens, once an imperial power, was financially exhausted. Sparta, morally and demographically ruined. Thebes, after a brief apogee, was also declining. Philip skillfully maneuvered in this power vacuum, presenting himself alternately as an ally, mediator, and finally, master. The final confrontation was inevitable. In 338 BC, a coalition of Athens, Thebes, and other Greek cities attempted to confront the Macedonian advance in the fields of Chaeronea in Boeotia. It was the last gasp of free Greece. The battle was a didactic demonstration of the supremacy of the Philician system. The Macedonian phalanx, commanded by Philip, engaged and contained the much larger and shallower Greek hoplite line. At the critical moment, the companions' cavalry, commanded by Alexander, then an 18-year-old, delivered a deadly blow to the Theban flank. The sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit of 150 pairs of warrior lovers, was annihilated on the spot, refusing to surrender. It was a massacre. The Macedonian victory was absolute. Philip did not seek total annihilation. He was a politician. In 337 BC, he convened a congress in Corinth. All the Greek city-states, except the intractable Sparta, sent delegates. There, the League of Corinth was founded, a treaty of Pane Hellenia that prohibited internal wars and established a perpetual military alliance, with Philip as its uncontested hegemon, supreme leader. The League's stated objective? To launch a war of holy vengeance against the Persian Empire, punishing it for the invasions of Darius and Xerxes. Philip skillfully cloaked his expansionist ambition in the noble garb of Pan-Hellenism, a dream that orators like Isocrates had been preaching for years. For Philip, it was more than propaganda. It was the ultimate geopolitical logic. Persia, under the aging Artaxerxes III, seemed fragile. Its western satrapies were rich and coveted. Its army was a patchwork of multicultural contingents. The wealth of Susa and Persepolis was legendary. The plan was in motion. In the spring of 336 BC, a vanguard of 10,000 men under generals Parmenion and Attalus had already crossed the Hellespont to establish a bridgehead in Asia Minor, probing the Persian defenses. Philip was at his peak. Macedonia was unified under his iron fist. The path to eternal glory, to the conquest of the East, was open. He was preparing the wedding of his daughter, Cleopatra, to the king of Epirus, an event that would celebrate his hegemony. Everything was ready, and it was precisely at that moment, at the apex of his destiny, when fortune seemed to smile unconditionally upon him, that fate revealed its cruelest irony. In the theater of IJ, during the wedding festivities, a man emerged from the crowd. He was not a foreign enemy, but one of his own bodyguards, a young nobleman named Pausanias. Personal motives, palace intrigues, the hidden hand of Queen Olympia Marongias, or Alexander himself? The theories are many. The fact is that Pausanias' Celtic dagger found its target. Philip II, the man who had transformed Macedonia from a bankrupt state into the greatest power in Greece, the architect of the army that would conquer an empire, fell dead to the ground. His great dream had seemed to die with him. And in that bloody vacuum that followed, one question remained, echoing at every court from Athens to Susa. What would the young man of 20, son of the deceased king, do now, having inherited not a consolidated throne, but a storm about to erupt?
The summer of 336 BC was supposed to be the pinnacle of Philip II's reign. In the ancient royal capital of Aegae, the Macedonian court was celebrating the marriage of the king's daughter, Cleopatra, to the king of Epirus. This was no mere social event, it was a meticulously orchestrated political spectacle. By uniting his lineage with that of Epirus, Philip consolidated his western frontier and demonstrated to all, Macedonians, Greeks, and Persian observers, that his power was absolute and his empire a stable reality. The public ritual in the theater was the culmination of this demonstration. Philip, confident enough to enter unarmed, preceded by statues of the 12 Olympian gods, embodied the idea that his kingdom was under divine protection. It was at this very moment of ultimate triumph that the endemic violence of Macedonian politics delivered its most catastrophic blow. One of his own bodyguards, the young nobleman Pausanias, emerged from the crowd. The motives were complex, a mixture of personal resentment, palace intrigues, and possibly the hand of hidden interests, perhaps even those of Queen Olympias herself, or of factions opposed to the war in Asia. The Celtic dagger he carried did not merely wound a man, it pierced the heart of a state project. The blow was swift and deadly. Philip, the architect of the new Macedonia, the unifier of Greece, fell at the feet of the very gods he had invoked for his legitimacy. The shock was instantaneous and the chaos total. In the blink of an eye, the work of 20 years of political and military genius was on the verge of collapse. The Macedonian vanguard in Asia, under Parmenion, was isolated and vulnerable. On the northern borders, the eyes of the Thracian and Illyrian princes gleamed with the prospect of plunder. In Athens, the orator Demosthenes, Philip's eternal adversary, dressed in festive attire and proclaimed the death of the tyrant. In Thebes, whispers of revolt began to circulate. And within the court itself in Pella, the power vacuum filled with hungry wolves. Alexander was only 20 years old. His mother, Olympias, was an Epirot princess, viewed with deep suspicion by the Macedonian nobility as an influential and dangerous foreigner. There were other suitors, a mentally disabled half-brother Amyntas, and the sons of noble Macedonian women, all with their own supporters among the aristocracy.
What the world did not immediately understand was that Alexander was not a gentle student molded solely by the abstract teachings of Aristotle. His true education had taken place in the shadow of his father, in the war councils, and, more concretely, on the battlefield of Chaeronea. There, at 18, he had commanded the decisive cavalry charge that shattered the sacred band of Thebes. He knew the veteran generals, Parmenion and Antipater, not as distant figures, but as subordinate commanders. He understood the psychology of the Macedonian army, and above all, had internalized the unwritten rules of the power game in his court. It was a game where survival was not a right, but a daily conquest. His response to the chaos was an act of pure political will, executed with a coldness that defined his character. First, he secured the foundation of all power in Macedonia, the army. Presenting himself to the assembly of soldiers, he was acclaimed king by them, an essential ritual that directly linked the monarch to his military strength. Then he moved to eliminate any seed of dispute. Executions followed. Among the first to fall was his cousin Amyntas, a potential rival with royal blood. Other nobles suspected of divided loyalty were silenced. This was not the emotional revenge of a teenager. It was the surgical cleansing of a survivor who understood that in Macedonia, mercy towards a rival was commonly a death sentence oneself. However, the acclamation in Pella was only the first step. To the Greek world, he remained Philip's son, a boy on the throne. Taking advantage of this, the turmoil grew. Thessaly, home of Greece's best cavalry, closed its mountain passes and declared its independence. Thracian tribes attacked the northern border. And then came the most dangerous blow. In Thebes, the heart of anti-Macedonian Greek nationalism, the rumor circulated and was believed that Alexander had been killed in battle in the Balkans. Incited by Athenian and Theban exiles, the citizens surrounded the Macedonian garrison on the local Acropolis, Cadmea, and proclaimed the freedom of Hellas. It was the ultimate test. If Thebes triumphed, the revolt would spread like wildfire throughout Greece, destroying the League of Corinth and burying forever the dream of an invasion of Persia. Alexander's response was an exercise in overwhelming strategic and logistical genius. Instead of marching directly south, he first turned to Thessaly. Instead of confronting the Thessalian army in the well-guarded pass of the Tempe Valley, he executed a daring maneuver. His engineers found an alternate route through the mountains, and his army, accustomed to forced marches, cut it off. Suddenly, Alexander appeared behind the Thessalian lions, in the heart of their plains. The display of audacity and speed was so impressive that the stunned Thessalians submitted without a fight, and, crucially, placed their formidable cavalry at his disposal. With Thessaly secure, Alexander descended like lightning to the Isthmus of Corinth. He convened an emergency meeting of the Hellenic League. The presence of his now reinforced army and the still fresh memory of Chaeronea were persuasive arguments. The delegates, with visible reluctance, reaffirmed him as hegemon. Only Sparta, ensnared in its anachronistic pride, refused to participate. Its disdain was legendary. If Alexander wishes to be a god, let him be one. For Alexander, the affront of the Spartans was irrelevant. The formal loyalty of the other cities was what mattered. But a colossal problem remained: Thebes. The city had not only rebelled, it had openly defied his authority, attacked his troops, and believed him dead. While Alexander finalized matters in Corinth, the Thebans, confident in their imposing walls and the promise, which would never materialize, of Athenian aid, prepared for a long siege. They calculated that the young king would be occupied for weeks, perhaps months, consolidating his power. It was then that Alexander executed one of the most impressive forced marches of antiquity. Receiving news of the Theban revolt while still dealing with matters in the north, he ordered his army to move. In just 13 days,
He covered the astonishing distance of over 480 kilometers from the forests of Thrace to the plains of Boeotia. When the Macedonian vanguard appeared before the walls of Thebes, the city was paralyzed with disbelief. It was a ghostly apparition, a feat that defied logic. The very element the Thebans considered their ally, time, had been annihilated by the king's iron will.
Before the closed gates of Thebes, Alexander did not offer a negotiator's ultimatum. He offered an executioner's choice. He demanded unconditional surrender and the handing over of the revolt's leaders. The Thebans, seized by a fatal patriotic fervor and still doubting the young king's resolve, refused. It was the decision that sealed the fate of one of the oldest and most glorious cities of Hellas. Alexander was not there to besiege. He was there to punish. The attack was swift, methodical, and brutal. The Macedonian Phalanx, the same machine that Philip had created, advanced against the walls. The Hypaspists, his elite infantry bodyguards, led the assaults on the weakest points. Legend, perhaps embellished, recounts that Alexander himself, at the head of a small group, exploited an unguarded breach and opened a gate from the inside out. The tactical reality was probably more prosaic, but no less devastating. The professional discipline and concentrated shock power of the Macedonians overwhelmed the static defenses of the Theban citizen soldiers. Once the defenses were breached, the battle degenerated into an urban massacre. The companions' cavalry stormed the narrow streets. The fighting took place house to house, yard to yard. Alexander, leading from the front as he always would, was wounded early in the battle by an arrow or dart, a wound that temporarily incapacitated him but did not remove him from command. The Thebans, fighting desperately for their very existence, offered fierce resistance but were outnumbered, outmatched, and outfought by the relentless onslaught of a professional army. When the last resistance was crushed, Alexander faced a decision of historical consequence. He could be magnanimous, pardon the city, and try to win over its citizens, or he could be merciless and set an example that would echo for generations. He chose calculated terror. In an act of brilliant political cynicism, he handed the judgment of the city over to the delegates of the League of Corinth, the very Greek states that envied and feared Thebes. The verdict was therefore a collective death sentence signed by Greece itself. The punishment was of an almost unprecedented severity in Greek history. The leaders of the revolt were executed. The city of Thebes was condemned to total obliteration. Its walls were systematically demolished. Every building, except the temples of the gods and the house of the poet Pindar, a calculated gesture to show selective cultural respect, was razed to the ground. The Theban territory was divided amongst its rival city-states. And the final act, which shocked even the hardened standards of the time, the surviving population, estimated at about 30,000 souls, men, women, and children, was sold into slavery. Thebes, once a hegemonic power that had defeated Sparta, ceased to exist. It was literally wiped off the map. The psychological impact on Greece was seismic. An icy silence, heavy with terror, fell upon the city-states. In Athens, which had sent symbolic aid and whose orators had incited rebellion, panic set in. The assembly, in emergency session, approved hasty resolutions. An ambassador was sent to Alexander, not to protest, but to congratulate him on his victory over the Theban traitors and to wish him good luck in his Persian campaign. The great orator Demosthenes, the architect of the anti-Macedonian resistance, remained silent. His influence evaporated. The message was clear and unequivocal. The era of independent Greek city-state politics was over. Philip had conquered Greece by force and diplomacy. Alexander dominated it through absolute fear.
With Hellas now not only united but domesticated, Alexander could finally breathe and turn his eyes fully to the east. The fate of Thebes was not an act of empty cruelty, it was a fundamental piece of strategy. He ensured that, as he marched into Asia, no revolt in his Greek rearguard would threaten him. In the following 2 years, he further solidified his power, conducting lightning campaigns up the Danube to definitively pacify the Thracian tribes, demonstrating the continued effectiveness of his army. The pan-Hellenic dream of a war of revenge against Persia, once a banner of convenience for Philip, now became Alexander's personal crusade. He had inherited the hammer forged by his father. In Thebes, he proved that he would not hesitate to use it with full force. Now he was ready to turn that hammer and wield it against the greatest empire in the world.
Spring in 334 BC arrived in Macedonia, laden not only with the fragrance of flowers, but with the metallic sound of an army mobilizing. In Pella, the nerve center of the kingdom, Alexander made the final preparations. The army that was gathering was the physical culmination of his father's work and the most concrete expression of his own ambition. It was not a horde, but a tool of lethal precision, a calculated amalgam of forces. Its core was undeniably Macedonian, 12,000 phalangites, the Petsetsleroi, bearers of the 6-meter Sarissa, the backbone of the entire strategy, and 3,000 hypaspists, the elite infantry that served as his personal guard and versatile shock force. To these were added 7,000 hoplites from the allied city-states, now subordinate, Athenians, Thebans, the few remaining loyalists, Corinthians, whose heavy bronze armor represented the Greek military tradition that Macedonia had supplanted. There were also 5,000 mercenaries, professionals who fought for pay, not for loyalty, a life insurance policy in flesh and blood. The cavalry, the decisive arm, was equally diverse. 12,000 Thessalian cavalrymen, considered the best in Greece, 600 Greeks from other regions, and about 900 Thracian and Paeonian scouts, the eyes and ears of the army. In total, about 40,000 combatants, accompanied by an equally vast multitude of servants, engineers, merchants, and camp followers. It was a microcosm of the world that Alexander intended to conquer, already marching under his command. But Alexander, a student of Aristotle and a devotee of Homer, understood that war was as much an act of storytelling as of force. He was not merely a king marching on a campaign. He was a character entering an epic poem. Before departing, he undertook a secret and significant pilgrimage to Eleusis near Athens. There, he submitted to the Eleusinian mysteries, the most sacred and secretive religious cult in the Greek world. The initiation was not merely an act of faith, it was a powerful propaganda statement. By being accepted into the mysteries, he, the Macedonian king, was recognized and blessed by Hellas itself in its most intimate sanctuary. He departed not as a foreign conqueror, but as a consecrated Greek leader. The crossing of the Hellespont was then choreographed as a public ritual, the antithesis of the secrecy of Eleusis. On the sands of Sestos, on the European shore, sacrifices were made to the gods. Legend has it that Alexander personally took the helm of the flagship and, in the middle of the strait, sacrificed a bull to Poseidon, lord of the seas, and poured libations from a golden cup to the Nereids, nymphs of the waters. It was a plea for safe passage, but also an assertion of control over the element that separated the two worlds. When the ship's prow scraped the sand of the Asian coast near Abydos, Alexander leaped,
He did not disembark, he invaded. Dressed in his full armor, he was the first to touch enemy soil. Then, in a gesture that blended pure theater and archaic legalistic assertion, he hurled his spear onto the beach and declared aloud that he accepted Asia as prize conquered by the spear, a gift from the gods. It was a Homeric spectacle, a deliberate echo of heroes claiming lands. With that single gesture, he transformed the invasion into a legitimate conquest in the eyes of gods and men. His first destination on Persian soil was not a fortress or a rich city. It was a field of ruins imbued with meaning, the legendary Troy. For Alexander, this was not merely an archaeological site. It was the stage for the poem that was his secular Bible, Homer's Iliad. He ran naked, as was the athletic custom, to the supposed tomb of Achilles, his childhood hero and model of Arete, the warrior excellence that led to eternal glory, even at the cost of a short life. There he crowned the tomb with garlands, and it is said that his close friend, Hephaestion, did the same at the tomb of Patroclus, Achilles' companion. The symbolism was profound and personal. Alexander placed himself in the role of Achilles, and Hephaestion in that of Patroclus. He was not merely visiting history, he was inserting himself into it, assuming the mantle of the greatest warrior hero of his cultural pantheon. Meanwhile, on the other side of the mountains, the Persian governors, the satraps, reacted to the invasion. They gathered, but were divided. The voice of reason came from a man who perfectly understood the approaching danger. Memnon of Rhodes, a skilled and veteran Greek who served the great king. His strategy was cold and logical. He advised a scorched earth policy. Retreat, burn the crops, empty the granaries, deny Alexander any sustenance or decisive battle. Meanwhile, the powerful Persian fleet, superior to the Macedonian one, would attack Greece and cut its supply lines, strangling the invasion logistically. It was a brilliant and potentially fatal plan for Alexander's campaign. But the Persian satraps, proud nobles accustomed to ruling their domains like princes, rejected the advice with disdain. To allow a Macedonian boy to plunder the provinces of the King of Kings with impunity, it was an intolerable affront to their honor and authority. They would settle the matter on the battlefield, as was fitting for men. They chose the terrain carefully, the Granicus River in Phrygia. It was a formidable tactical obstacle. Its waters, still swollen with the spring thaw, were swift. Its banks were not gently sloping, but rather steep and precipitous, almost like an earthen cliff in many places. For the Macedonian heavy cavalry, a charge upstream would be slow and disorderly, turning the horsemen into static targets for the Persian archers. For the Phalanx, maintaining cohesive formation while climbing a ravine under attack would be a nightmare. The Persians believed they had found the perfect mousetrap.
When Alexander's scouts brought the news, the Macedonian camp tensed. The enemy had not fled. He was formed, waiting. The Persian army massed on the eastern bank of the Granicus was an impressive and exotic sight. Its main element was the cream of the cavalry from the eastern satrapies, the Medes and Hykarians from the Iranian plateau, the Bactrians from the distant eastern steppes, all armed with a deadly combination of composite bow and short spear, mounted on agile and hardy horses. It was a mobile and lethal shock force. Behind them, on higher ground, was the infantry, poorly armed local militias, and, crucially, a corps of about 10,000 Greek mercenaries.
These men, professionals like many of Alexander's soldiers, were the most stable force in the Persian line. The Persian commanders, however, distrusting their loyalty in a battle against other Greeks, positioned them in the rear, a tactical error that revealed their internal divisions. In the Macedonian War Council, the voice of experience spoke loudly. Parmenion, the old general who had served Philip with unwavering loyalty and whose prudence was legendary, advised caution. It was late afternoon. Attacking now would mean crossing an unknown river against a prepared defensive position with the light fading. "Let us encamp, your majesty," he must have said, his deep voice heavy with the weight of decades of campaigns. "Let the men rest. Let us cross at dawn in full formation with the sun in our favor. We shall see what we do." Alexander heeded the advice of his most experienced general, and then, with that mixture of brilliant intuition and godlike arrogance that would become his trademark, he rejected it. For him, hesitation was a worse vice than risk. Waiting until dawn would give the Persians time to reinforce their positions, or worse, to reconsider and adopt Memnon's wise strategy of retreat. Alexander could not allow the battle to slip away. He had to force it, then and there, on his terms. Gathering his officers, his speech was not one of debate, but of absolute determination. He argued, according to historians, with a wickedly brilliant logic. The river itself, he said, which seemed such a great obstacle to them, would be an even greater obstacle to the Persians in their flight should they be defeated. Furthermore, he challenged the morale of his men. Would it not be an eternal shame, after crossing the great Hellespont, to be stopped by a mere stream of Asia? It was a mixture of cold, tactical logic and an emotional appeal to honor, the rhetorical technique of a born leader. The order was given. It would not be a general frontal assault. Instead, Alexander ordered a concentrated and sharp movement. The right wing, where he himself would position himself with the companion cavalry and the hypaspists, would move first. They would not form a line to slowly cross. They would advance in column, like a clenched fist, and strike a specific point in the Persian line that Alexander had identified as vulnerable. It was a bold and dangerously audacious tactic. The Macedonians moved to the banks of the Granicus. On the other side, the scene was one of disdainful confidence. The Persian cavalry, their chainmail and scale armor gleaming in the afternoon sun, lined up in their long, impressive line. Many laughed, shouting insults across the water. To them, the scene was one of obvious madness. The young barbarian king was making a fundamental mistake, surrendering himself to them. Among his officers, they pointed to the distinct figure in the gleaming armor with the distinctive white-plumed helmet. There stood the Macedonian king himself. It was a prize in sight, a chance to end the war in a single blow. Alexander mounted Bucephalus, the gigantic and temperamental black steed that only he could tame. The horse seemed to sense the electricity in the air, impatient. Alexander raised his spear, the Ziston. Silence fell in the Macedonian right wing, broken only by the sound of the water and the snorting of the horses. The signal was given. The charge began. It was not only Alexander's first great test against Persian might, it was the litmus test of the entire military system forged by Philip II. It was the test of the Phalanx, the Sarissa, the doctrine of the hammer and anvil. But above all, it was the test of the very legend that Alexander was determined to create. The entire Macedonian war machine, the entire destiny of the young king, was about to collide at full speed against the steep bank of a foreign river, defended by the most skilled cavalry in the world. And on the other side, the immense and confident Persian army prepared itself, spears lowered, bows drawn, ready to receive him. Next, the first test of blood, the Battle of the Granicus River.